Raise your right hand. Do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully testify in connection with this trial?
I do.
Please have a seat. Remove your mask, please, and then state your full name and spell it.
Travis Melland, Melland.
All right. There's a court reporter taking down everything that is being said in the courtroom. Yes or no, and start shaking your head, right? No, or wait until the question's finished before you answer, so two people are not speaking at the same time. If an objection is made, stop talking. Don't answer it unless I tell you to, okay? And if you don't understand a question, of course, let the lawyer know, all right? Counsel?
Mr. Melland, could you please state your occupation for the record?
I'm a forensic scientist for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
How long have you worked for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Crime Lab?
For approximately 6 years now.
Could you discuss your current duties with the crime lab?
Sure, my current duties are to compare ammunition components found at a scene to each other or to a firearm if it was recovered.
And how many years have you been doing that sort of work in the firearms lab?
I've been with the firearms lab for about 5 years now.
Okay. Could you discuss your education and training to conduct such comparative analysis?
Yes, first I earned my Bachelor of Science in Forensic Biochemistry back in 2014. Once hired at the BCA in the Firearms Laboratory, we go through a year-long extensive training module in which we learn about the different makes and models of firearms, their history, how they operate, and then also with ammunition components and how they interact with those different firearms. And then we go through and hundreds of different ammunition components and gain that cognitive ability, what constitutes an identification versus an elimination from a firearm.
Okay. And as part of the BCA's yearly evaluation process, are you evaluated regularly every year to verify your proficiency in this sort of work?
Yes, we go through annual proficiency tests in the firearms lab.
And have you testified in court as an expert before?
Yes, I have.
Okay. I'd like to talk generally about the background underlying firearms examinations. When an individual loads a semi-automatic firearm with ammunition, do you have a name for that type of ammunition, for a live round of ammunition?
Oh, yeah, a live round would be considered a cartridge.
Okay. What are the component parts of a cartridge?
So a cartridge is comprised of a projectile, commonly a bullet, with a propellant or the gunpowder inside, an ignition source, which would be the primer end of the cartridge, all housed within a metal casing.
Okay. And the casing being the fourth, right?
Casing is the fourth part, correct.
All right. Now, when the gun fires, what happens to the component parts of the cartridge?
So when a semi-automatic firearm is discharged, the primer portion, which contains the ignition source of the cartridge, is struck by the firing pin. It creates an impression on that cartridge case, and then creates an exponential amount of gas and pressure. This allows the bullet to then travel down the barrel and out the muzzle of the firearm, picking up rifling characteristics from that firearm, as well as pressing against the breech face or the rear end of the firearm as well, before it is then ejected from the firearm.
Okay. When you conduct a firearms comparison, what items or components are you typically examining and comparing as part of your work?
Typically, we are looking at cartridge cases and bullets.
Okay. How does the examination of discharged cartridge casings and fired bullets enable you to draw conclusions about the use of specific firearms?
So when a firearm is discharged and those components interact with that firearm, it picks up markings from that firearm that we can use and look at under a comparative microscope to make an identification or elimination or some conclusion.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what class characteristics and individual characteristics are?
Yes. So class characteristics are those that are predetermined by the manufacturer. For example, these include the caliber or the size of ammunition that the firearm takes, the size of the rifling or the grooves cut inside the barrel, the directionality of the rifling of the barrel, along with the firing pin shape, the shape of the aperture in which the firing pin goes through on the firearm, and as well as the finishing of the breech face that the cartridge case will press up against as well. If any one of these class characteristics differ, we can eliminate those components from being fired from that particular firearm. Individual characteristics are incidental to the manufacturing process and are more of the microscopic detail that are created through the manufacturing process, but also through the use, abuse, wear, and tear of the firearm itself.
Okay. And in terms of individual characteristics then, does comparing these enable you to draw conclusions about when a specific firearm was used?
Correct. We use individual characteristics for our conclusions.
Okay. I want to zero in just on discharge cartridge casings. I think you've talked about where specific markings are left on these cartridges when they're fired and ejected. Because of those marks left on the discharge cartridge casings, that's how you can compare and identify when they're ejected from a particular firearm?
That's correct.
Okay. And you can compare two discharge cartridge casings which are fired from different guns?
Yes, we could.
Okay. And that's using your sort of comparison microscope?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, let's say you only recover a single discharge cartridge casing and a single firearm. Are you able to somehow evaluate whether the discharge cartridge casing was fired from the gun?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Could you explain to the jury how that's done?
So we evaluate the firearm for those class characteristics. If all the class characteristics are in line with what we're seeing on our evidence cartridge case, then we can move on to test firing that firearm. And then we collect cartridge cases that we know of came from that firearm, as well as bullets during this process. Then we can physically compare the cartridge case known from the firearm to the evidence cartridge case collected at the scene.
Okay, so you do eventually do sort of an apples and apples comparison against discharge cartridge casings. It's just that you know the test fired one came from a particular firearm. Is that about right?
That is correct.
All right. Now, when you conduct your work on a given case, does your work go through a verification process?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And that requires another forensic scientist to examine your work and to evaluate your conclusions?
Correct. Another examiner trained and also signed off in the same discipline will verify our conclusions.
Okay, so that's discharge cartridge casings. Now let's talk about fired bullets. If you only have a fired bullet and a particular firearm, do you have to go through a comparable test firing and recover a test fired bullet to conduct a comparison?
Yes, similar to cartridge cases, we'll evaluate for class characteristics, and then if those are in alignment, then we go through and test fire, and we'll compare those known bullets from the firearm to the bullets if they were collected at the scene.
Sure. And this question might be just 1 + 1 is 2, but if you have a single bullet, single firearm, and a single discharge cartridge casing, you can compare all three items together, correct?
We only compare to a firearm. There's no way for us to compare a particular bullet from coming from a particular cartridge case.
You need the firearm for the test-fired bullet and the DCC, right?
That is correct.
Okay, I want to move on to the testing you did in this case. Did you receive a request to examine evidence?
Yes, it was.
And was that request made by Agent Mike Phil?
Yes, it was.
All right. With regard to the work performed here, were you asked to retrieve certain items of evidence which had been collected and inventoried at the BCA?
Yes.
Okay. Of the items, am I correct that you obtained 3 items?
That's correct.
All right. And when you obtained those items, they were assigned a lab number?
That is correct.
All right. And you generate a report based on your work in this case, correct?
And that is correct.
All right. And those 3 items that you got were item 7, that was a single 9mm discharge cartridge casing that was collected by Melissa Lauren. Item 13, which is a Glock 7 9mm firearm, which was item number 13. And then item 31, a projectile or fired bullet, item 31. Is that correct?
That does sound correct.
Okay. So the purposes of your testimony today, we can agree that you got a single discharge cartridge case and a single bullet and then the firearm.
That's correct.
And you were asked to compare them.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, before we talk about your results, I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same items. Permission to approach the witness, Your Honor. Mr. Melland, I'm showing you exhibits 199, 202, and 200. I'll show them to you each. I'm showing you exhibit 200. Would you agree that is the discharge cartridge casing?
Yes, it is.
Exhibit 202. Oh, pardon me. Item 201. You recognize this as the fired bullet?
Yes, I do.
And then exhibit 199. Exhibit Cramel item number 13. You recognize this as the firearm?
Yes, I do.
Were you able to compare the discharge cartridge casing to the firearm?
Yes, I was.
Did you follow the same method and procedure that you discussed a few minutes ago?
Yes, I did.
And what was your result?
I concluded that the fired cartridge case and the bullet covering the scene were fired by the firearm in this case.
I'm sorry, you might have went beyond my question. I just asked about the discharge cartridge casing. Did you also make a similar conclusion about the fired bullet?
My apologies. Yes, I did.
Okay, so in the end, your findings are that that firearm fired the DCC and fired the fired bullet in this case.
That's correct.
All right. Now, I have a couple additional questions about the firearm. Did you conduct an examination of the firearm as to its functionality?
Yes, I did.
All right. And did you confirm that it was functional?
Yes, I did.
As part of your examination, were you able to examine an aspect of the firearm called trigger pull?
Yes, I was.
What is trigger pull?
In short, the trigger pull is the force necessary to pull the trigger or fire the gun.
All right. There's a phrase some laymen use, dropping the hammer. Have you heard of this phrase?
Yeah, more commonly with revolvers. But
Okay.
yes,
Well, that's what we're talking about. How much weight does it take to fire the gun?
that's correct.
Can you tell? Can you measure how that is? How much weight that takes?
Yes, we can.
Could you describe for the jury how that's done?
So we have a static weight apparatus in which we can hang known weights and poundages and hang that off of the trigger of a firearm. We measure to a point of which we can lift up on the firearm and not have the trigger get depressed consistently, and then also keep adding weight until we're consistently getting the trigger to depress, and we create a range of what that trigger pull would be.
Now, is there a typical range for force required to pull the trigger of any firearm? Typical range?
Yes, in my experience, anywhere between 3 and 9 pounds is fairly average.
Okay, so in this case, were you able to measure the trigger pull of Exhibit 199?
Yes, I was.
Right. And what were the results there?
It was approximately 5.5 to 6 pounds.
Okay, so within the normal range.
That is correct.
Okay, no further questions, Chairman.
Mr. Pecross? Oh, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, there's no further witnesses this afternoon.
Okay. All right. Okay, members of the jury, we're going to stop early today, okay? And we'll start up at 9 o'clock. All right. I want to assure you that we're still on schedule, okay? All right. So have a great evening. Can counsel please be seated? All right. The state filed 2 motions. I'm wondering whether the defense wishes to put in a written motion or just do oral argument on them.
Oral argument.
Okay. All right. Let's start up at 9 o'clock. I'll review the state's motions tonight, and maybe we can discuss them tomorrow. Okay? Is there anything else we need to put on the record?
On the record, no, but the state does wish to be heard in chambers with regard to an issue.
Right now?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Come on back.
We start at 8:30 tomorrow after the motions.
I don't know.